Brooklyn dropped the first game of the series on the road in Boston on a buzzer beater from Jason Tatum. There are adjustments, however, that Steve Nash can make in these rotations, how the players are being utilized, but ultimately it will come down to as well the execution from the players on the court. We're going to break down how Brooklyn gets to a game two victory coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. That's right. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Armbrecht, covering the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And the topic of discussion is, how does Brooklyn win game number two? We came in the post game following that loss, Doug and I fully in the fan bag, feeling all of the emotions of what was a knockdown, drag out playoff basketball game. And certainly one that if Brooklyn had been able to pull it out, you would have probably said, in spite of a subpar performance from Kevin Durant, you stole that key game on the road. Now you maybe try to really put the pedal down and steal game number two. But now the pressure is there. We talk about being the road team. You know you're going to need to steal one here along the way. Game two would obviously be a key opportunity to do so before you head back to Brooklyn. And there's a number of factors here, right? We talked about some of the key sequences there, and we're going to touch back on them and look at them from, I think, a little bit of a objective level as to why results don't matter when you're trying to examine the good or bad in a given sequence of plays over the course of a game. Now, there are things they can do. Doug highlighted rotational pieces. We talked about some of the positive takeaways we had from some of these role players. What adjustments do we think Steve Nash can make here going forward to try to make it as, guaranteed as possible that they're on the right foot going into game number two and hopefully coming out with a win? The first part that we're going to talk about here is something that Doug touched on. We said that Nicholas Claxton had one heck of a performance in that first game. We've mentioned it down the stretch of the season. The physicality, some of the bigger assignments, they haven't really impacted them the way that they would have a year ago, the way that they would have 3 months ago, early on in the season, when he just looked like a guy who was dealing with some little injuries, some illnesses, and didn't look like he was someone who was building into that young frame. Cut two, though, he's there. He's there on the interior, on the defensive and offensive end. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be perfect. Obviously, he's still going to be outmatched from a size and physicality standpoint, but he's making all the effort plays. He's able to be effective. And I think we highlighted last time around that when you went inside the box score here and you looked at Claxton, giving you 31 minutes, 6 of 8 from the field. He gave you 8 total rebounds, 6 on the defensive end. That's obviously as important as anything that you're going to get out of him. And then 13 points overall, came away with 3 blocks as well as a steal, only had 1 turnover. So he's playing smart basketball on the offensive end, making the right reads. Obviously, when he got to the free throw line, just 1 of 5. And that's a theme in and around the 5 spot here. But Doug highlighted that maybe the time now is to move on from Andre Drummond in that starting rotation, who gave you 17 minutes, just 3 of 4, but picked up obviously the 4 very quick fouls, 8 points, and was a relative non-factor in this one. Someone had mentioned it over in the YouTube comments as well, getting him into the starting rotation. When you look at the numbers and the minute shares, it's somewhat symbolic if you want Nicholas Claxton to start. Now, you can talk about the ebbs and flows of the game. We've been mentioning how when you talk about the transition basketball, trying to play at pace, obviously Claxton's done a really nice job with that. And if you think about it in tandem with Kevin Durant, there certainly would be an opportunity to say the fluidity with which Claxton and he have had a connection at the back end of the year might offer Kevin Durant a little bit more of an outlet when it comes to getting down into the offensive sets, working towards the basket quickly, getting it out of his hands more quickly, rewarding his teammates, and then maybe that adjusts how the Boston Celtics look to approach him defensively. The issue here, arguably with Claxton and with Drummond, we'll stay here at the 5, is that we know they struggle at the foul line. So what are the big adjustments that you can make in behind that? Because if you're saying you're going to put Nicholas Claxton into the starting rotation, the follow-up question has to be, who comes next? Because it's not enough just to put the 17 minutes off the bench for Drummond, it's still going to be a net negative. Can he have a bounce back game? Of course he can. Can he avoid some of those fouls? Certainly. We said there were a lot of whistles early in this game. It didn't matter in the ultimate outcome, but it certainly impacted his availability over the course of it. We know that we have not seen LaMarcus Aldridge that much, and that we have also not seen Blake Griffin at all. And Steve Nash had mentioned going back a couple of weeks when they said they was asked in a post game press conference, what about the idea of using Blake a little bit more at the 4? And this is probably pre James Johnson being cut so that they could bring over Kessler Edwards into the postseason roster. And Steve Nash said, listen, we really view his biggest value at the 5. So looking at him in these minute shares here, that's not going to be the answer. It's going to come solely at this position. And then when you think about Claxton being there, you think about Aldridge being there, it's hard to pull that minute share from somewhere and say that Blake's going to be able to do it. To go inside his numbers, and we'll do the same thing here for a second with LaMarcus Aldridge. In the last 2 games, and this is why it's a bit of a mixed bag. He played mixed bag, 16 minutes and then 7 minutes in the last 2 games in February at the beginning and then end of the month there. In the 16-minute performance, he came up in that one, gave you 6 points and 6 rebounds. You liked it. It was a massive net negative. It's a game where they got blown out, so you expect that. But you only played 7 minutes in that really tight game at the end of the year, the last meeting for these 2 teams with a big performance from Jason Tatum. It's hard to look at that in this sample size and say, well, here's a guy that the coaching staff believes can have an impact in this. Now, the ironic thing is, Doug had said how Andre Drummond was bad in the last game against the Celtics. So the fact that you maybe already had this sample size that said this might not work, you can certainly question the idea of should you have just gone to something different right out of the gate? You can make that argument, and I would understand it. The problem being is I don't know how much more dynamic Blake Griffin would really be for you. I think certainly defensively, if you're talking about switching on some different assignments, okay, we saw Drummond was out there picking up Jason Tatum on the switches as well. But I wonder about the interior piece of it. We know that Blake is king of taking the charges, so maybe that's an area that he can get his body into the right place a little bit ahead of schedule and be disruptive on the defensive floor that way. And obviously, there's a different type of upside on the offensive end. He's a good ball handler. He sets obviously very solid screens. And we know, though this season was a bit of a downfall for him, he is capable, at least potentially, from shooting from the outside. There's some flexibility there. But again, if Steve Nash is looking at this as being at the 5, then you're talking about taking Claxton off the court and going with Blake Griffin, and now you're into that small ball rotation. We're going to get into a little bit about the Kevin Durant piece and working him at the 5 in this series as well. So you understand that if philosophically, whether you agree or disagree with it, if philosophically the Nets look at Blake Griffin and say he's playing at the 5 or he's not playing at all, that's why you're not seeing him. Do I think that you could try to go to him? Sure. The other guy that you could try to go to is LaMarcus Aldridge. I think that that's probably the more obvious one from a fan perspective. You feel like he's deserving of an opportunity here. We know he was coming back from injuries. Again, go inside the numbers on him, though. The last 2 performances when he played against the Boston Celtics, 17 minutes, gave you 9 and 4, followed it up with 23 minutes, gave you 4 and 5. The offensive game is there for him. I think you look at it in the same way that you do Drummond on the defensive end. There's only so much that you're going to be able to ask of him. The switching is going to be there. We say it when you look at Patty Mills, someone we'll touch on a little bit later. When he's on the court, that's the guy they're going to hunt in switches. It doesn't mean anything to Patty Mills or to LaMarcus Aldridge's ability. It's just that that's always going to be the weak link matchup. And if you think about getting into switches where LaMarcus Aldridge is trying to pick up Jason Tatum, that's going to be a disaster. Did Drummond pick up a lot of fouls? Yes, he did. Is he more fleet-footed than LaMarcus Aldridge? Yes, he is. So there's a balancing act there. The trade-off that you're getting on the offensive end, which is going to be that this is a guy who obviously can be king of the mid-range. And I think if you're talking about balancing the books around where the value is, that's what you're looking at. You're saying, when you look at Claxton, you look at Drummond, neither one of these guys is doing anything from a shot creation standpoint. So now if you're going to work LaMarcus Aldridge in and around the foul line, inside the arc there, you can potentially, if Boston wants to stay at home on Kyrie and on KD and maybe even shade over with an extra player to try to disrupt and keep the ball out of their hands, well, Aldridge can certainly knock down a handful of buckets there in the mid-range and maybe force Boston to a little stay at home a little bit more, keep a body on them. And that can force some adjustments as well. I think that that's what we're talking about here. How do you force the issue back onto Boston and Ime Udoka to say, here is our new wrinkle? What is your response going to be to that? And really, it's about winning in the margins. When you make that adjustment and you run LaMarcus for a few minutes and you get some positive offensive possessions, does it open up things a little bit more for Kevin Durant? Does it take some of that weight of physical pressure that they were putting on him all game long off of his shoulders to just allow him to get into his rhythm? And we talked about so much down the stretch here for Kevin Durant, looking for others, looking to create and facilitate for others. If he can lean into that a little bit more early and see the success around him, it could force Boston to make an adjustment there. Doug and I talked about this off pod. It's hard to look at saying, and we've even heard shout out to Clash Bandicoot, one of our big followers, love him over, obviously in the videos over on social media, really appreciate him. He's been calling for Day'Ron Sharpe. And as Doug would say, if you're going to Day'Ron Sharpe, the wheels have really come off. And that's nothing to do with Day'Ron Sharpe. It's just, that's not the part of the plan here. And that's why when you come into this series, Marcus Aldridge, not necessarily a part of the plan. Blake Griffin, really not a part of the plan. So if you're already going to these moves after one game, I think it kind of diminishes what your mentality and approach was to the series. Series are about adjustments, but I don't know how quickly you want to pull that ripcord. I want to get into another player here, though. Mentioned Patty Mills. Going to talk about Kessler Edwards, his minute shares, along with Goran Dragic, and just figuring out where can some of these minutes automatically shift in game number 2, and how can that benefit the Brooklyn Nets on the defensive and ultimately the offensive end as well. Before we do, though, we've got to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. You've heard Doug talk about this all the time on the podcast. You know the deal. If you're tired of going into fantasy matchups where you're trying to beat every maven on the market rather than just playing against the line, you got to go check out Prize Picks, because you pick 2 to 5 players and an over under on their projections, and you can win up to 10 times on any entry. And it's just you versus the projected numbers. Again, it's not about all the sharks, right? The stock market fantasy basketball players. No, my friends. Entries can be made in easy as 60 seconds. That's how quick it can be to get in on the action. Prize Picks is also safe and offers fast withdrawals. You use the award-winning app on both App Store and Google Play, and Prize Picks is going to offer you a variety of options, from props that you can make. Think of them like points scored, maybe you want to go with rebounds, maybe you want to go with steals. Prize Picks can even be mixed sports if you want it to be. You want to take Kevin Durant over in the upcoming matchup, but you also like Tiger Woods getting out of the first round at a certain stroke number. Yeah, you can take a look at those. When the NBA season and NFL season are in action, I want to give me Patrick Mahomes to go over on touchdowns, and also Kyrie Irving to be plus 30. That's the kind of options that you have here on Prize Picks, which makes it that much more exciting. You can check out Prize Picks, not just for NBA, as we say, but also college, basketball, college football, NFL, MLB, soccer, MMA, and so much more. You can combine over point totals and also knockouts. That's the kind of good times you can have over here. And for a limited time, Prize Picks has an exclusive no-brainer of an offer for all our users. You go ahead and get $50 for free if a player in your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point, but you must use code NBA. Kevin Durant, single point. That's right. Exclusive offer available to Locked On fans. You sign up today and use the code NBA, $50 for free if your player in your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point. You're going to want to go over, of course, to prizepicks.com and get in on all the action, or check it out on your App Store or Google Play device. And when you're done with that, you're also going to want to head over to Bet Online. That's because betonline.net is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports information. You find out the latest sports developments. That's right. What's developing? The Brooklyn Nets coming back in this series. If you go over there right now, you can find out that to win the series, the Nets are plus 90, Celtics minus 220. This is a rare opportunity to take the team that has the better players and still make money on the series. If you're feeling absolutely nuts, you can take the Pelicans getting 1,500 to come back there against the Suns. I don't know if I like those chances. I even feel a little more inspired in laying the long odds, minus 4,000 for Phoenix to get out of that one. But it's a great time. And we know that Bet Online obviously has you covered from all of your sporting wagering information, the live betting, the playoffs, the esports, and so much more. You head over to the website or use your mobile device, and you can find all the trends and latest action. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. And so, where we start, we said inside of these rotations. We're going to stick with this for a little bit longer here because the secondary piece for me is I mentioned, I kind of threw out that Dayron name just to set the table and expectations around. There's certain guys that you can go to, there's certain things that you can do, and there's certain things that should not remotely be on the minds of the Brooklyn Nets fan base. Now, again, when you go inside these numbers from the last game, before we get into coaching, before we get into execution here, you take a look and see that you have Patty Mills giving you 12 minutes, goes 1-on-1 from the field, 3 points, nothing else. I mean, it's 12 minutes. It is what it is. You also, as we highlighted last episode, saw Goran Dragic really be able to hold his weight on the offensive end. The length, the veteran presence, he just knows what he needs to do. Now, are there liabilities defensively for both of these players, especially Patty Mills, because of how consistently, Boston can bring size at you? There's going to be bad matchups there. And I think at this point, when you take into account that Dragic is more than capable of holding his own and pouring in 14 points off the bench, if you believe that Claxton can continue to play with that level of consistency and give you 13, then you go inside that starting rotation and say, we know we have Curry, 9 points early. He has to be better throughout it. Only played 30 minutes. We have to assume the ankle is still an issue there. Obviously, Kyrie Irving went off, and then Bruce Brown. And these are just kind of the guys that fall into that everyone else category. Bruce Brown over 37 minutes just needs to be a little bit better, picked up those 5 personal fouls. I think you're going to see him get into all those little details that he loves to be a part of, the steals, the defensive energy, and obviously he has to get a couple more points here. We need him, probably Bruce Brown, to be closer to double digits here in both rebounds and in points scored. Well, he doesn't be going off for 15 and 15, but you got to give me an 8 and 12 night with some level of consistency over this series. But Kessler Edwards played 4 minutes in this one. And again, as we've highlighted these matchups between these two teams over the course of the season, the one thing you can say is, again, 3 matchups that Kessler Edwards appeared in, 3 minutes in the first one back in November. We're not going to tally that one up. But 15 minutes, and this is why there's a contrast here. This isn't a flawless choice that I'm saying that the Brooklyn Nets should be making. 15 minutes, 0 points, gave you 3 rebounds in that performance back at the beginning of February, but then followed it up in the last appearance of the season. 19 minutes, 13 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, hit everything from the field, obviously, also hit everything from beyond the arc, 3 for 3, knocked down 2 attempts at the line. It only took on 2 personal fouls, by the way, in those minutes as well. If I'm looking for an immediate adjustment, because again, go back to the top here. You want to put Claxton in the starting lineup, okay, fine, but it's really about who do you want to eat up those Drummond minutes? You saying you want to take Drummond completely out of the lineup, and then you have to live with the push and pull of what could happen in behind him and the other adjustments. But Kessler Edwards, who saw a run in this game, as microscopic as it was, I would make the argument that if you believe that Seth Curry is going to be better than he was in this one, at least more consistent over the entirety of the run, Kessler Edwards is a guy that we know. He's the only 3-and-D wing they have on the roster. He's the only guy capable of picking up certain defensive assignments to take it off of the plate of Kevin Durant and to potentially take it off of a Goran Dragic, depending on who else is on the court with them, how big they're running. And he's also a guy that can knock down the perimeter shots. Now, we said he's not a ball handler, so you can't expect him to get into the wash a little bit in some of those really tight physical sequences. And I think that that's the biggest thing working against him and against any of the young players on this roster right now, is that Ime Udoka has this team in Boston incredibly well coached. They know exactly where they need to be. They know how to be disruptive. They use their hands. They block the passing lanes, and they get up on you in a hurry defensively. And I think you do worry about, in a games like these, one bad 5-minute run from Kessler Edwards where he has a couple of turnovers and a little careless with a basketball. And just like that, you could see a 7-point swing in a game that is staying pretty close from wire to wire. But I would push more in that direction. I would consider the idea of taking those 12 minutes from Patty Mills and saying, hey, I'd like to see Dragic play maybe 30. And if you're going to keep him in 25 because he is older, he is the veteran, I'd still like to see Kessler Edwards get himself closer to 10 minutes of game action here. Give him 2 runs, try to give him one, maybe a little bit earlier in the game, and then maybe come out of the third quarter as well, out of the halftime break, see if he can catch a little bit of a rhythm there, and obviously give you some defensive upside as well. It's about balancing the books. And right now, when you think about the times when, if Bruce Brown, who did have one 3-pointer, yes, which accounted for 3 of his 6 points, 5 points. If you're thinking about the spacing and the size factor here, you got to find a way to just mix and match a little bit. Now, is this a scenario where we're talking about bumping Kevin Durant to the 5 and getting Kessler Edwards on the floor and then utilizing Kyrie Irving and Seth Curry and Goran Dragic, or with Bruce Brown, because we know his flexibility? Maybe. But that's probably one that I wouldn't mind seeing. And it's not even a knock on Patty Mills. It's just, this is a rough series for him. Likewise, Doug had said it in the last episode as well. See you, Andre Drummond, when we take on the 76ers and everything that you do matters that much more and can be that much more valuable. It may have to be a hard decision that the Nets need to make. And I'll be curious to see if they choose to go that route. All right. We're going to also talk about these late game sequences, because this perspective that when something doesn't go the way you want it to, that automatically the process by which you got to that result was flawed, wrong, and needs to be different. There are elements here. I know everyone wants to talk, obviously, about Steve Nash. We're going to get into it, but we're also going to include inside of that where the player responsibility lies inside of some of these closing sequences and key moments that led to a 1-point loss. Remind you, this was a 1-point loss. So in all of these changes and adjustments that we're talking about, you have to remember this was a game that was lost on a last-second buzzer beater layup. It didn't get blown out, so there's no reason to feel like the sky is falling. We'll break that all down for you, my friends, right after, though. We, of course, take a brief moment to tell you about our friends at rockauto.com. Oh, my goodness. If Doug were here, he would tell me that there is no less than 7 car parts, probably no more than 7,000. We're not entirely sure. The number's somewhere in the middle, or maybe well beyond that. Frankly, I don't know enough about cars to make a determination. But what I do know I can make a determination about is going over to rockauto.com when I need to get a car part for my vehicle. That's because you save time and money on Rock Auto. Why would you spend 30, 50, or even 100 times more by going to a local auto parts store? They're going to walk into the back, grab you some weird box. You don't know if it's the right part. You don't know if it's for your car, your make, your model, the year, and you end up paying a premium for it as well. You can search these parts for yourself. Search for your make, search for the model, the exact part, and know that you're getting a great price, and it gets delivered right to your door as well. I had to get new wiper blades because it's springtime. And if you're on the East Coast, my friend, springtime is when that rain starts falling and the flowers start growing. But it also means when you can't see at night and you're driving, if you have bad wiper blades. Got right over there, dropped it down, 22s in the mail. I'm putting them on myself because I'm a do-it-yourselfer, as I know you are too. You get over to rockauto.com right now, use their easy to navigate website. And when you get over to that, how did you hear about us box? You drop in Locked On Nets so that they know that we sent you. Head over to rockauto.com right now, as we say, see all the parts available for your car or truck, and its amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Rockauto.com. All right. So lastly, then, the big piece that we want to talk about here, I know everyone is up in arms about Steve Nash, but I just want to break down a couple elements of this and why you can say responsibility falls in a couple different ways. Now, first off, we've heard this a lot before, that the continuity for this team, right? Listen, at a certain point, you're all NBA players. You got to figure it out, right? And we're going to get into kind of the focus, the execution side of this in a second. From a coaching perspective, there's a couple of things. One thing maybe I didn't like, and you can go either way on this. When the Nets have their last offensive possession and they're up 114 to 113, there is a little bit of this roaming nature by Kyrie Irving. He has an opportunity, maybe get it to Goran Dragic. He works himself into the lane. This is where we're almost going to kind of go tandem here as far as execution and decision. There's an opportunity to call a timeout if you want there. The Brooklyn Nets had timeouts to use. So you can take a look at that if you're Steve Nash from the sideline and say, whoa, whatever we thought we were going for here, it's not working. Let's just go ahead and reset ourselves a little bit. The downside probably is that with Boston, the physicality, the presence, the way that they get themselves set defensively, as we saw going the other way, Doku didn't want the Nets to be able to get their right personnel out there, get a better defensive lineup set so they were ready to execute on that end of the floor in the final sequence. So they went ahead and pushed for it. You can split hairs a little bit on that. One other element inside of it too is when you see Kyrie Irving kind of roaming through the lane, there does become a little bit of stagnation. Nicholas Claxton just kind of gets caught in no man's land. And the problem is, we've heard some people say he's got to get himself out into the corner to clear out that space, but no one's respecting him out in the corner because he's not capable of knocking down those shots. So there is just a personnel factor here that limits what the Brooklyn Nets are able to accomplish. I wouldn't have hated if you had seen a timeout called there. I wouldn't have hated, especially once the dish goes to Kevin Durant. It doesn't look like it's working. Now, when you're down to 2.53 seconds on the shot clock, you see the double team is coming over to him. Go ahead, try to reset yourself there if possible. That's fine. But I mentioned already in there this one execution piece. We said it last episode. Is coaching involved in Kyrie Irving throwing away the inbounds pass to Marcus Smart for an easy layup? No. Right, like that's an execution piece on the final sequence, and I'm not even lambasting anybody about it. But what happens? You have out in the corner Marcus Smart and both Bruce Brown and Nicholas Claxton. Bruce on the big flyby, excuse me, and then Nicholas Claxton is right there trying to close out on it. So you send two at him. It's a great play by Marcus Smart, gets into the lane, kicks it over to Tatum, boom, game over. Okay, fine. But what was that the execution of the defensive game plan? Or was it a frenetic pace where everyone's trying to reach and cover and find their spots? And obviously, you end up with two guys going with them. And then right in behind him, Kevin Durant is kind of caught in no man's land out near the top of the key. He has, I'm not sure who it is out in front of him, but he loses track of Tatum, ducking in towards the basket and catching that pass and going for the layup. If Kevin Durant is active and moving back in towards the paint at that point, because he has the length and the quickness to get back out and recover if there's going to be a shot from the perimeter, he might be right there to intercept that pass and the game is over. Attention to detail matters. It's not me making excuses for Steve Nash. There are things about it, like the offensive sets, as we've said time and time again. If it's not that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are choosing to play iso ball, which, by the way, in that particular game, Kyrie was doing it and it was working wonders. On the other side, when Kevin Durant was forcing it and trying to find his rhythm, it wasn't working as well. Okay, but the need for specifically run sets to create a flow and a rhythm is something that where I saw it, the first 3-4 plays of the game, we saw the combination of the good and the bad. The bad was the clunkiness, the ISO ball. Then it works into Andre Drummond. He kind of gets caught in the low post, try to kick it out sloppy, couple of turnovers. But the first two buckets that the Nets made were these fantastic sequences where Drummond hung out near the foul line. And when he got it, he became the trigger man. They worked double actions. You had Seth Curry come all the way around, back out to the top of the key, faked on the pump, drove into the lane, and knocked down a mid-range jumper. Like, that was the designed set play, and they ran the offense to perfection. Whether or not adjustments are coming throughout the game and you're not seeing then that rebalance going the other way, that's certainly possible. But there's at least some element here where I'm going to say when you have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, yeah, we're going to go the way of them. It doesn't mean that the execution can't be better, but I've seen these flashes, these glimpses of really strong play that just does not seem to carry over throughout the entire game. There's stagnation too often. And the big question that I think we end up coming to is that based on coaching and strategy, or is it based on personnel? Because where did we start at the top of this? Adjustments that we think this team can make. And when you go back inside of it and you just think about, for as hot shooting as Bruce Brown and as good of a player as he's been over the stretch, again, I expect him to be better. But you're talking about having Seth Curry on a bad ankle. Seems like that's still impacting him. Where is the other consistent threats going to come from here for this team? Patty Mills has been up and down. It looks like he's back into his rhythm. Very consistent for his career as far as what happens to him in the second half of the season. But this is a tough matchup for him to have success with. So if you're taking one of those shooters and minimizing what his value can be, maybe you can elevate Kessler Edwards and get a spark from him. Maybe you reduce Drummond and you look to go to, again, like we said, a LaMarcus Aldridge for a little burst here, maybe for a Blake Griffin. But if you're doing Blake, that's for the defensive upside and maybe a little bit about the passing, which we know Drummond is really good at as well. Obviously, he can set the screens. LaMarcus Aldridge is going to be the offensive move you make. And if you're willing to live with the defensive results, that's fine. At some point, and I said this before, Doug and I have talked about this, at some point, you're just trying to eat fouls. So whoever you want to use the most of late, including Bruce Brown, who's going to have to take on bigger matchups with consistency, buy me a couple fouls on Blake Griffin, buy me the fouls on Drummond in a smaller spurt, buy me the fouls on bad mismatches for LaMarcus Aldridge, and then know that I can go to the best version of this lineup late when it matters most. At the end of the day, though, the only thing I'm going to push back on is it was a 1-point loss. Like, yes, Kyrie Irving went off, but Kevin Durant struggled. They were down 15. They surged back. This was a one possession ball game all the way down, except for that chunk at the start of the third quarter. That's what this game was. It was back and forth. It finished with 22 lead changes. There was 17 of those in the first half. So this idea that these enormous adjustments need to be made, I can push back on it and say whether or not Drummond's going to be the most effective, if he just takes a little bit longer to pick up his fouls, it might be okay. If Bruce Brown can get a little bit more shots than 3 in the game, it's going to be all right. If Seth Curry can maybe just knock down 1 or 2 more shots with consistency throughout the game, it's going to be okay. And if Kevin Durant gets back in his bag, it's going to be okay. It's why when we did, so we officially checked in on Twitter, the bummer scale. It's why I'm low. It's why I'm low on the bummer scale, because there's enough here on paper to say the Nets are more than capable of coming back and taking game number 2 here. Tomorrow, we're going to get right back on with John Carolus. We're going to get his perspective on it. We know he had the big prediction, Boston Celtics in 5. It'll be interesting to see how he feels coming out of that game. Ultimately, a win is a win, but were there issues or things that he saw from the Boston's perspective, the defensive perspective, that gives him pause when we're talking about Kyrie Irving and what we think will be a return to form Kevin Durant? In the meantime, though, you get over to YouTube, you get into the comments, chop it up, man. I mean, listen, I've laid it out. What do you want to see more of? Do you think that Kessler Edwards is deserving of a big minute share? Do you want to at least push the, hey, let's take it easy? I think the very obvious one that everyone is looking at is how do you get better value out of 17 minutes from Drummond? Who can step in there? And I get it. The options are on the table there. It's just going to come down to if Steve Nash and the Brooklyn Nets want to go with a small ball 5 lineup with Kevin Durant the 5, which mitigates using a LaMarcus Aldridge, which mitigates using a Blake Griffin to some extent, though I disagree a little bit. And you know that you can then move Nicholas Claxton out of that spot and still keep him on the floor if you chose to, or surround Kevin Durant with shooters and just try to force the spacing and the floor for Boston to have to cover a lot of ground. But that's the case. Listen, I got thoughts here. I got thoughts for days. We'll see how it plays itself out. We'll get in and talk with John tomorrow, set the table for the big game 2 on Wednesday night. As I said, get into YouTube, like, subscribe. We always love the conversation, love the support that everyone's been giving us. Get after us on social media as well. No quote today shy of saying, let's get ourselves in order here and get geared up for a win on Wednesday night. We'll be back again next time for myself and for Doug Norrie, talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.